Welcome to the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. We are here each week to help you lead more confidently and make a bigger difference, both professionally and personally. This episode is sponsored by 13 Days to Remarkable Leadership, a free leadership video series based on Kevin's book, Remarkable Leadership. Sign up by going to remarkablepodcast.com/13 days. And now, here's your host, Kevin.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to Monday. Welcome to another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast Live. So glad that you are here. Let me ask you a couple of questions. Would you like to get breakthrough ideas for yourself, for your team, for your organization? Well, today you're going to learn about a proven yet perhaps surprising way to do just that from an expert, and I'll introduce him in just a second. So again, welcome to another live episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. You can get all future live episodes and therefore interact with us and see them sooner. In this case, about 2 months sooner than it will go out on the podcast by joining our Facebook or LinkedIn groups. Just go to remarkablepodcast.com/Facebook or remarkablepodcast.com/LinkedIn to join us for that and lots more. And now, if you are here with us live, while you're here, I want you to imagine that you're joining us for a cup of coffee. So please feel free to share your questions, your comments, and your ideas. It'll make for a better conversation and eventually a better podcast episode. Today's episode is brought to you by our new book, The Long Distance Teammate. If you work remotely and want to be more effective, more productive, more engaged, and more connected, this book will help you get there, because there's a big difference between working from home and being an engaged and effective remote teammate. You can learn more and get your copy at longdistanceteammate.com. Let me introduce today our guest to you. His name is Cyril Bouquet. And let me tell you about him, and then we're going to dive right in. He is a professor of innovation and strategy at IMD Business School, where he orchestrates all kinds of innovation journeys for companies that seek to create the future. He is the co-author of a brand new book. For those of you live, it's out tomorrow. It's called Alien Thinking, the Unconventional Path to Breakthrough Ideas. He joins us today from his office in Switzerland. Cyril, welcome. Glad that you're here, sir.
Yeah, glad to be here, Kevin. Thank you for having me so much.
It is an absolute pleasure. So I like to ask people this question, because when you meet interesting people, it's always interesting to know a little bit about their journey or their path. I'm guessing when you were a kid, you probably wanted to be a doctor or a fireman or a police officer. You probably didn't think, I'm going to become a professor of strategy and innovation. I'm just guessing. So tell us a little bit about your journey. Yeah.
Believe it or not, I absolutely did not want to become a professor. My two parents were professors themselves. So I kept telling everybody around me, the last thing I want to do is to teach. And of course, I guess somehow it was my destiny, because I am Canadian, but I'm also French. And in fact, at that time, I had to do a military service for France. And one way that you could do your military service was to actually do a civil service. And so I was doing my studies in Canada, and then France was asking me to do this military service. And instead, I found a job as a professor at the University of Ottawa. And I was in contact with the French embassy, and I was representing France for a couple of years. And then all of a sudden, I felt this was the most extraordinary thing that I could do. But it was really a way of fulfilling my duties, if you will, that motivated me to look into this path and then go back to school, do my PhD, and ultimately do the job that I love so much today. But my parents were surprised, I have to admit.
That's awesome. That's an awesome way to look at the story. So, I'm really excited to talk to you live here on the day before the book comes out. And having had this day many times, I know how exciting it is. So tell us just briefly about why you and your colleagues, I'm going to ask you a little bit more about the colleague part of this in a second, but why did you all write this book?
Yeah. So I guess, we are here in a very special place in Switzerland. It's called IMD. It's a business school that was founded by business executives. In fact, a group of senior executives from Nestle in the 50s went to Harvard Business School to say, can you help us set up a corporate university? And instead, IMD was set up with a very special mission, which is to help real companies, not just Nestle, but in fact the large multinational corporations around the world, but also a number of startups, to work on real issues. And for the last 12 years now that I've been at IMD, of course, I've done research, but I've also worked with people who are absolutely talented, who are part of industries that are going through a tremendous degree of change, who want to make a difference to the world that they live in. And so they go on those journeys where they're trying to innovate. And whether they're working on a new service or a new way of working within a company or an industry, right? I've seen a lot of motivation at work, and I've seen successes and failures. And over the years with my colleagues, we try to simply document what could be improved, right? And I think we came up with a pretty strong view as to what could be done differently. There's a lot of guidance out there. There's a lot of methods that exist, and we could see people going through those methods, right, and not always achieving the results that they truly were hoping to get, right? And so that's why we came up with a way that I think reflects our own experiences in the last few years. 12,
That's perfect.
12 years.
So having written books alone and written books with co-authors is a different experience. And the specific question that I want to ask you about writing this with Jean-Louis and Michael is, you wrote a book about innovation, right? And you wrote it together. And so how is the book different, or how was the process different from a creativity and innovation perspective? Because there's three of you. Like, what can all of us take? This isn't really a podcast about publishing, right, and writing, but I'm curious about the connection between that and the topic area.
Yeah. So absolutely. So I think we got together because we all had a very special, sort of contribution to make to this conversation about how can we come up with breakthrough ideas in organizations where we realized that a lot of the situations that we were faced with led a bunch of talented people to come up with rather incremental change than a more breakthrough type of solution. And so each one of us, I think, had a lot to contribute. I was a typical sort of faculty working with large corporations on purely pure innovation journeys, if you will. So whether they are 3 months, 6 months, a year, and I've had a lot of experience. Mike is actually our digital expert. He was leading the Center for Digital Business Transformation at IMD in partnership with Cisco for many, many years. And obviously we knew and we observed firsthand the power of digital technologies to completely transform the way we approach creativity, the way we try to innovate in large organizations, that a lot of the guidance that is given to us by design thinking or the lean startup still applies. But today you can do things a little bit differently using the tools that are at our disposal. So Mike really wanted to bring this part of the conversation, if you will, to the attention of executives we were working with. And then Jean-Louis is our sort of leadership expert, right? Where everybody that has been on those journeys knows that there's this invisible task right behind. So yes, we have an objective. We are trying to bring progress to the world, but at the end of the day, it's a bunch of people coming together, trying to function as a united team, bringing their own personalities, their own egos. And there's a lot of things that can, sort of help your success moving forward. But if you're not careful, the same qualities that can nurture your creativity, that can give you the drive, the resilience, the grit that you need to succeed, can also derail you. And so we wanted this book to be not just an innovation book, but a true story of people going through a major attempt to bring progress to the world. And it is to some extent also a journey that is filled with emotions and where people have to bring their best self. And so that's how we sort of combine, right, our expertise and interest in terms of writing this book.
That's awesome. So for those of you that are joining us live, please share your thoughts, share your questions. We'd love to hear them. I've got plenty I can ask and plenty for us to talk about, but I'd love to know what you're thinking as well. So you mentioned stories. There's a lot of stories in the book. We'll get to sort of the big ideas of the book in a second, but maybe as a way to start, why don't you share one of the stories that is maybe one of your favorites, or one of them that you think might help illuminate part of what you're trying to help us learn?
Sure. I guess, I will pick the story that is the closest to my heart, because it's the story that involves a person I know quite well, who happens to be the son of my mentor at IMD. I've met a lot of wonderful people at IMD since I started this career, and one of them is Bill Fisher. He's written a lot of books on innovation and teams. But his son, so not only is a great professor at IMD, but his son happens to be an epidemiologist and who was involved in the fight against Ebola. And that's a terrific story, because I think it shows us, what we're trying to do in the book, but also some of the challenges, if you will, that are associated with the idea of trying to challenge the existing paradigm, but also do it in a way that brings support rather than resistance. Right, which we often see with breakthrough innovators, is that they are so disruptive in their thinking that they also create a context that becomes quite difficult for other people to deal with. And so Bill was actually a professor at the University of North Carolina in the US at that time, and again he was not an Ebola expert. He was a critical care specialist, and of course he studied pandemics. But one day he receives a phone call from the World Health Organization telling him, Billy, so his name is Billy, his father is Bill, but his name is Billy, the son, and can you come to Geneva for a month, to help with some technical issues? And he's like, of course I can do that, I'd be closer to my father, that's great. Except 72 hours later, there was a change of plan, and now they wanted him to fly to West Africa to fight one of the deadliest Ebola epidemics. And of course, he was scared. Right? I mean, should I do this? The particular village where they wanted him to fly, a 90% mortality rate, right? So the people who were admitted to the quarantine system would die for 90% of them. And he was not an Ebola expert himself. So it's like, what am I going to contribute to this fight against the deadliest pandemic? But
by the way, everybody, his wife didn't want him to go either. Just saying. You want to put yourself in the situation that Cyril is creating for you to understand. And you got a wife in the U.S. saying, no, I don't want you to go. I'm like, go ahead.
Exactly, right? And of course, the kinds of situations we face in our own lives often are not life and death, right? You're not thinking, if I go on this pursuit, I put my life at risk. But in his mind, that was a significant factor, but in the end he decided to go, and essentially what the story we describe in the book is that the fact that he was not an Ebola specialist helped him to think about the situation very differently, and challenge the operating paradigm of the World Health Organization, and end up with a much better way of taking care of people who suffered from Ebola. So the short story is that when he arrived, we realized that there was a system in place that is very much a system that we have today to deal with COVID. You identify people who are infected, right? You quarantine them or you isolate them, and then you track all the people who've been in contact with the infected person, essentially. Except that paradigm for Ebola was not working so well, because what was happening is that Ebola was a death sentence. So the moment people were admitted in quarantine, for the vast majority, 90% of them, they would die. And so what were the local families doing? They were trying to escape the quarantine system, right? They were trying to hide their loved ones from the World Health Organization, because they were afraid that the moment they would be put in the treatment center, they would die among unknown sort of people and not be able to do their proper rituals, right? And so essentially, Billy managed to convince. And at the time, he was part of a team of Doctors Beyond Borders working with the World Health Organization, that they had to treat people and not just quarantine them. And with very simple procedures of giving a lot of fluid to people, anti-malaria medication, antibiotics, he was able to decrease the mortality rate from 90% to less than 60%. And that totally changed the perception. And now people trusted, right, the medical system that was in place. They were willing to work with the quarantine rather than to escape it. And again, what I like about this story is that what the solution that he came up with was breakthrough, because he was actually challenging the paradigm, right? But nobody else was able to do that before. But he was not a rebel, if you will. He's not somebody that was disruptive and said, the current paradigm is broken, let's fix it. He was a rebel with a cause. he cared about, an objective that was dear to a lot of key stakeholders. And when you challenge the paradigm, but because you show that there's maybe a slightly different way of achieving a cause that everybody really cares about, then you're much more likely to bring support that can help you on your journey of change. And that's what he did. And of course, there's a lot more details in the book, but that's probably one of my favorite stories.
Well, I was actually kind of hoping that'd be the story that you would tell. It's the story, everyone. When you get your copy of this book, it's the story that opens the book. So there you go. Now you've got a head start. Now, so there's this book called Alien Thinking: An Unconventional Path to Breakthrough Ideas. So what do you mean by alien thinking? What do you mean?
Yeah, so indeed, right? Alien thinking is first a metaphor, right? I mean, obviously, we could have said this is the outsider mindset, or is the beginner's mindset, is the immigrant's mindset, right? I've been an immigrant most of my life, and in fact, I've lived in so many different countries. Every time I arrive in a place that I wasn't from, I realize, hey, there's a different way of doing things, and it's challenging my own understanding of, what is the right way of doing certain things. But when you get used to that, you realize that, geez, the world is rich, right? It's rich of interesting approaches to situations that exist. And you can probably learn, right, from all those different approaches, right, and grow as a person. And so we could have called this, but the alien mindset first is this metaphor that you can imagine an alien coming into Earth, maybe would have a very different view of how Earth is organized, right? And maybe the alien would say, oh, this is interesting. This planet is inhabited by cars, and cars have slaves that drive them around. Right? It's not what we believe, but who is right? and so in a way, it's a metaphor that you have to get rid of all these assumptions that are coloring the way you think about the future, the way you think about, what are the problems that exist could be solved, what are the solutions that make sense, because we are biased in how we look at the world. And so we need to enrich, right, the lenses that we consider before we construct our system of understanding, if you will. So that's at the first level. But then beyond that, because it's a little bit like saying, think out of the box, fight your biases. We hear that all the time, but that sounds great in theory. But how do you do it, right? How do you do it in practice? And then again, there's a lot of guidance. I'm a big fan of design thinking and the lean startup. And, there's a lot of richness into all of those frameworks that exist. But when you see people and the way they apply those frameworks, it becomes like filling a template. You have a few bin bags, you have post-its, and you have a few templates to fill out, and you think that you're on your way to innovate. When more fundamentally, it doesn't matter if you use post-its, if you have bin bags, and if you created, the right space. The right space is in your mind. And so alien thinking is also an acronym where we have 5 strategies levers that people can action that can help us to really increase their odds of being breakthrough in their thinking. And so we can go over each one of them if it makes sense or not, but that's what we describe in the book. And A stands for attention. How do we look at the world? How do we impose meaning on the world? L stands for levitation, which is actually step back, right? Let's stop looking, right? We are overwhelmed. There's so much information out there. Let's step back so that we can give ourselves a chance to pause and reflect and think. Then imagination is a bit, are we able to think like kids, right? We don't have all the answers at the start. We are willing to play with ideas. We are willing to connect ideas that may have nothing to do with each other, but in the process, we discover some new ground and we envision ideas that simply do not exist today. Then experimentation is about how do we experiment? And again, every innovation approach will tell you you've got to experiment, but the way we do it often is wrong, right? And one executive told me once, if you torture the data long enough, it will confess. So often we are testing ideas, but we are not there to learn, right? We are there to seek evidence that comforts our thinking. So we should be fluid and remain open to discovery, which often we are not when we experiment. And then the end is the navigation, and that's the most complicated part, right? For most people in an organization, there are a lot of forces that can help your success in an industry, in an organization, in the world when you're trying to bring change to the system. But there's also a lot of forces that can block you, that can create resistance, and that can stall your efforts. And so navigating those forces, whether the positive or the negative ones, are extremely important. And this is where we see a lot of people fail, right? This is where the rubber hits the road. I think that's the expression, right? We have to learn how to navigate very carefully. And people often underestimate the complexity of doing that. And so we sort of go, and the book is organized around those different lenses, if you will, that you can apply, right, in your own context. And it's not just all about business. It's about any interesting situation that you face in your own life. If you want to come up with more breakthrough solutions to those situations, this is a framework that we hope can help you.
So I really like the book, and the book is different in some of the ways, Cyril, that you've described. There are a couple of the lenses, a couple of the letters that are people probably have some context for, right? Seeing the world with fresh eyes, producing the ideas, those are things we've heard more. So I don't really want to talk as much about those, not because we couldn't, but because I'm going to assume that those are the ones that people will have some core understanding of.
Yeah.
I'd like you to talk about levitation, this idea of finding a totally different viewpoint. Can you talk about that a little bit more? Give us a couple of practical ways that we can do this levitation thing. And you're not talking about letting us be able to float. Actually, that would be cool. That would be a different book, however.
Yeah. No, thank you, Kevin. And especially I think your own work, right? I mean, also provides guidance with respect to the importance of being connected, right, to yourself when you're trying to bring change to the world, that you're trying to be a better leader. It's not all about, what am I doing with other people? It's also, again, how do I create a space for myself, right, to think about the future in interesting ways. And if you look at all the books that have been written on innovation, and all the guidance that exists in business schools, you often feel that you're on this race, right? You're on this race for building the next prototype and running the next experiment and building your business case, right? Typically, you have between 3 to 6 months to convince people that your idea has merit. Otherwise, it might be buried. And so you have this impression that it is about space. Now, interestingly, if you look at all of if you look at all of the truly breakthrough innovations that have emerged in the world of business or in other spheres as well, you realize that often it took time, right, for breakthrough ideas to emerge and to mature and to prove their merit and ultimately to become resounding success. And it's simply not time, it's also the space in your mind. And here we really went into, again, like, how is it that our brains work, right? If we want to be creative, there's a lot that we can learn from neuroscience. And neuroscience, and the science is pretty clear, that if you want your brain to come up with original ideas, it needs space, right? And so why? Because your brain needs to have the space to think about what's working, what's not working, right? Your brain needs to have the space to consolidate all of the experiences that you've observed and built in the past, and then make connections, right, in your neurons to be able to project views on the future. And here is the interesting thing. When they did experiments in the 80s where they put scans on people's brains, and they gave them 2 different types of tasks. So there were people who were busy doing something that was very complicated, a math puzzle or a cognitive challenge that was complicated to resolve. And they would measure what's happening in the brains of those people. And then there would be other people that would be told, just go for a walk, relax, don't do anything in particular. And then obviously they compare the 2 images that they got. But they also realize, this is interesting, the brains of people who are doing nothing, supposedly, is consuming 20 times more energy than the people who are actually busy doing a very complex cognitive task. And why is that? And then this is when we realize that, there's a lot of creativity going on. And if you don't disconnect from what you're doing and letting your brain to breathe, then there's simply no space, right, for the new light to come in, right? So the Japanese talk about the importance of math thinking, right? Which is, again, if you want to create something new, you need to give it the time and space that it requires to create. And so again, we often believe that the busy people are the most productive. In a lot of organizations, we want to observe people doing things. But if we want to create something new, we have to be able also to preserve the time. And so, in your own space, right, in your own mind. And Kevin, you're asking me what is it that we can do, right? Because
stop doing is what you're saying.
Exactly, right? And it's interesting now when I look at my phone, every week I'm reminded. It's like, Apple now tells me how much of my time I've spent, right, uninterrupted, right, without in a conversation with someone, without at a meeting, because everything is documented in my agenda. How much time do I have myself? And can we answer that question? And I remember an interesting discussion that I'd seen on TV between Bill Gates and Warren Buffett. And Bill Gates was amazed by the fact that Warren Buffett had entire days in the agenda with nothing on it. It's like, how could you have nothing on it? And because Warren Buffett said, I need time for myself. I need time to think, right? And all the great scholars of motivation, right? And Daniel Pink in his latest book, Drive, says, take a walk every day. 30-minute walk without your cell phone, and you will see, right? How often do we figure out that we are stuck in a given way of thinking, and then we say, okay, forget it, I'm going to do something else, and then the light comes in, right? Because all of a sudden our brain starts to fire, right, in a different way. So we need to meditate, we need to stop what we're doing, and also take the time, right, to pause, reflect, and think differently about the future.
So Cyril, I have done informal research on this. Ask people when did they get their best ideas, and they say things like walking, exercising, mowing the lawn, taking a shower. I told my wife I wanted to put a whiteboard in the shower, and she said, no, there will be no whiteboard in our shower. But I have been known to get out of the shower and go write something down at the sink.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, think about what they do in sports. I mean, again, like it's true. We can all feel that we had great ideas, but when things are not working, the sports teams call for a timeout, right? Like, don't continue, just stop, right? And give yourself a chance to reflect, give yourself a chance to review what could be done differently, and to reset the system, right? But Kevin, your research also shows, right? I mean, nobody told you I was in a brainstorming session with my teammates and all of a sudden it came out. Right? It's again, we need time to reflect on what we heard, what we saw, what we experienced ourselves, and then connect dots.
There's lots of conversation about back in the days when we could all be together. You use the word brainstorming, and the thought of we're just going to pop ideas, and that's all wonderful. And yet there's something to be said for give people the question and give them some time overnight. Here's the question we're gonna brainstorm on tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, and you'll get, not only will that help the more introverted people feel more like they're contributing, but all of us now have a chance for our beautiful subconscious minds to start to work on stuff, right?
Yeah, and it's interesting, like, one of the, my dear colleagues, Jake Knapp, I'm sure a lot of you recognize the name. He was working at Google, and then he pioneered this sprint approach, right? And so the name says it's a sprint. But I found it very interesting discussing with him to see that he bound brainstorming, right? I mean, he doesn't do brainstorming, collective brainstorming in a typical sprint process. He wants people to think individually, right, about one idea, but go deeper, right? Take the time to actually think it through, right? And then it's better if each person comes up with one good idea, and then we give ourselves a chance to explore 4 or 5, really good ideas, than if we just come up with, 180 ideas on post-its we put on the wall, and then we quickly vote to select the one that is supposed to change the world.
Yeah, I think it's really good. We got the chance, really, everyone, to dive into one of the 5 parts of alien thinking. We talked about levitation, but there's also attention and imagination and experimentation and navigation. And we don't have time. I knew we wouldn't have time to dive into all of them. So I'm going to ask a couple of questions more that maybe are topical and timely, that maybe go a little bit beyond the book. And so my question to you, Cyril, as we're trying in our organizations and in our teams to be innovative and to come up with really great ideas that can really make a difference, how has that been? What would you say about that process when we're doing it at a distance? In other words, how has remoteness, part of what we just said about time, it may actually help us, but what would you say to a group that's either still remote, going to be remote, or going to be largely remote as a hybrid team about this process? Do you have any quick advice about that?
Well, but it's interesting because for us also this crisis challenged a lot of the ways we were working with teams at IMD, right? I mean, 90% of the programs we run involve a lot of face-to-face interaction. We would travel together in different parts of the world to meet interesting companies, learn from them, and again, come up with new ideas. And it's interesting that we had to revisit those assumptions and experiment with new ways of doing things. And today, just today, in fact, and for the next 6 months, I'm working with a big Danish shipping company. So without saying the name, in fact, they are profiled also in the book. But it's interesting how everything now is done remotely, and there's a lot of advantages, right, to working remotely, right? And so, in fact, let me maybe say a couple of things that I've observed, right? Is that indeed first, we are forced to be. It can only work if we are present, right? We cannot be multitasking, doing other things at once. But if we are connected on the screen, we realize that we can have pretty good conversations these days because the tools are there, right? So whether you're using a conference system like Zoom or MS Teams or whatever platform you're using, it's very easy to be all together in one group, then to split the group in small breakouts so that we can run discussions in parallel streams, come back, share, but also the tools to interact with the broader ecosystem, right? So there are now platforms, and I don't want to necessarily, I don't know if I can advertise or not, but there are platforms obviously that we can use to collaborate on a digital world, but there's also platforms that we can use to collaborate with key experts and customers, in fact. And so in the past, my teams were often prisoner of, where are you based? Who are the customers you can talk to? And so on. And that's it, right? That's pretty much depending on where we're based and what contacts we have, we kind of go to those leads. And now you start to use platforms, right, that put you in touch with the whole world, right? And so you describe these are the kinds of targets, or in fact, the people that I'm failing to engage, right? That there are certain types of customers that never come, right, to engage with my services as a company. And you can identify those people online. And then you can actually interview them online. And so there are platforms now that exist that actually create that link with exactly the targets you're trying to engage. And so when you're in this phase of exploration and you're trying to improve your understanding of the world as it is, that it exists, there's a lot of things that can be done online, including in the book, we talk about a lot of companies that spend more time looking at internet forums by trying to interpret, the narratives, what is it that people actually talk about? How can I use that? And again, there are always been people who do this, specialist jobs in organizations. I'm not quite sure to what extent top executives pay attention to the information that come through those channels. Now that we live in this COVID world, actually people themselves start to say, why not? I can spend my time on those internet forums. I can look at what is it that people talk about, and this can inform my understanding.
And that's actually work, everybody. That's not like playing around. That's like real work. So, Cyril, before we go, a couple of questions I ask everybody that I have here. And part of I might know part of the answer to this first one based on what we talked about before we went live. But what is it that you do for fun?
I have two kids that are fantastic, 8 and 12. And because we live in Switzerland, we are privileged to be very close to the mountains. And so both of them, start since the age of 2. And so, for example, the last weekend, but that's pretty much my life every weekend and several times a week. In fact, we go to ski training, we go to ski races. And of course, because one is 12 and the other one is 8, it's often in very different cities. And that's what I do. And of course, I love this. And so it's outside, right? And Switzerland, whether you're on the lake, you're in the mountains, there's a lot that you can do. And anybody who loves the outdoors, and being also Canadian, I was used to this before, right? Canada is absolutely a fantastic country when it comes to the outdoors. And so that's what I do for fun.
And so for anyone who's watching live can see behind Cyril, you can see books on his bookshelf. If we turned my camera a little bit, you'd see a whole bunch of books on my bookshelf. What is it that you're reading? Or what's something you've read recently that people might be interested in?
All the books I have in my bookshelf, I don't even know when is the last time I actually opened one of those. So my best actually at home, not here, and I just happened to take the call from my office today. But it's interesting, and my mind changed, as we were going through this thing. But when you ask me, why did you take that job? There was a book that popped into my mind, and from David Lodge, and it was called Changing Places, and it was essentially the story of a business person, if you will, and an academic that sort of decide to trade lives. And it's a trilogy, it's 3 books, that are, that must be read together. And initially it's 2 people who really do not understand each other, who start switching jobs and switching lives, if you will, and then ending up realizing that they have a lot more in common than they thought they had, at the beginning. And to me, that's often a good story when I think about, like the need, if we want to create something new, we need to have empathy. We need to be able to put ourselves into the shoes of someone else. And initially it looks odd, it looks different, but if we manage to do that, there's a lot that we can find. And then initially the book that I wanted to mention, because you said, what was it recently? And that book was actually read a very long time ago. A Small World, Changing Places, all those books part of the same trilogy. But there's this book that I read to both of my kids, and I still read very often. It's called The Petit Prince, and so The Little Prince, and it's a philosophical book in a way, but it is full of magic, right? Where indeed, if you read that book, it's about this lone human being that is lost on the planet, and trying to wonder, what else could be there, right? And it's a fantastic story around, the art of possibilities and the art of imagination, and also fighting against things that don't need to be that way. And so I really encourage you. It's a very short book to read that and to read it to your kids, because it's a wonderful philosophy about what life could be, and the power of dreaming and fighting the constraints that we often impose on ourselves. I don't want to say too much because it's a very short book and you have to read it by yourself.
Well, if we end there about the power to understand the constraints we put on ourselves, that closes the loop back to the constraints that we put on ourselves and on our thinking. That Alien Thinking, the new book by Cyril Bouquet, his 2 co-authors, have just come out. And for those of you that are here live, tomorrow is the day. Here's the book. You can see it again if you're watching. And Cyril, where can people learn more about the work, find the book, etc.? Anything you want to share with people?
Yeah, absolutely. So we just put up together a website actually a few days ago, alienthinking.org. And it's a good resource because, in fact, you can find all kinds of stories that we've written with very interesting figures, where we dig in some of the aspects of the book. So you can discover all of that, including the story of Jimmy Wales, the inventor of Wikipedia, and you can see how this was an act of alien thinking. But there are many more. So if you go into the latest alien thinking, with I can see there's just a little typo here.
Yes, I left. Well, I was trying to do it while we were going, right? Yes, I left out an N.
Yeah, absolutely. But go and read those stories, and it's updated pretty regularly every day, and I hope you enjoy it as well, right, when you discover this resource.
alienthinking.org. And for those of you that are watching, I will put it up there spelled correctly now. There
Excellent.
we go. Alienthinking.org. So now the question for all of you who are watching or listening, whether it's live or later or on the podcast, the question is now what? What action are you going to take as a result? There has been plenty of actionable ideas. There have been plenty of practical things for you to try, whether you're trying to come up with a breakthrough idea in your family, in your life, in your business, wherever it is, you've gotten a number of ideas. The challenge for you is, what action will you take? The challenge might be for you to say, do I need to think more about attention or levitation or imagination or experimentation or navigation? And I wish we would have had time to get there more as well. But Cyril, it's been a pleasure to have you. I was looking forward to this. I enjoyed the book. I was glad that we had the chance to have this chat.
Thank you so much, Kevin, for having me. Really delighted to be part of the conversation with you today.
And everybody, this episode has been brought to you by the Long Distance Teammate. If you know, there's a big difference between working from home and being a part of a remote team, being a remote teammate. You can learn more about that book by going to longdistanceteammate.com. And we'll be back here next Monday at noon Eastern, as always, live. And we'll be back here every week with another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. Thanks, everybody.